Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Rick Fussell and this is the Ingrain Workshop. Are you tired of going out there on YouTube and seeing all these woodworkers using these red expensive squares for all their layouts on their woodworking projects? Well, have no fear. In today's video, we're going to be building our own squares. They're going to be considerably cheaper, high-end, and handmade. That's coming up next here at the Ingrain Workshop. So to make our squares, we're going to start with some blanks. We're making two squares. I've got two blanks of bloodwood here. Both are 5/8 of an inch thick. This one is 2 by 5. This one is 2 by 3, and those are just the rough dimensions. Later on, we'll cut them down to their final sizes. You'll need a piece of flat stock brass that's 1/8 inch thick by 2 inches wide by 12 inches long. You'll need two pieces of flat stock brass that are 1/16 of an inch thick by 1 inch by 6 inch. And you'll need two of those. Then we'll need some 5/16 rivets, and then some number 2 by 3/8 inch flathead Phillips head brass screws. And that's all you need to make both these squares. So off video, I took the 2 inch by 12 inch by 1/8 inch piece of flat stock brass over to the miter saw and cut it into a rough length of 7 1/4 inches for this one, which will allow me enough material to make the larger square, and then the remainder will leave me enough for the smaller square. So the next thing we're going to do is cut our blades and then our wearing strips, which are 1/16 of an inch thick, down to their final widths. So for the larger square, we're going to cut this at 1 1/4 inches, and then for the smaller square, we're going to cut it at 3/4 of an inch. The wearing strips are the same for both squares. They're going to be at 9/16 of an inch thick. So I thought it would be easier just to put them on the sacrificial wood. They're just double-sided tape to the wood, and then I'll rip them to their widths here at the table saw. Once we get the widths cut, then we'll go back over to the miter saw and cut them to their final lengths. So in case you didn't know, you are able to use traditional woodworking saws to cut metal, as long as it's soft metal like brass, aluminum, maybe some 01 tool stock. But anything harder than that, it's probably not recommended. So cutting through the soft brass here at the table saw is not going to be an issue for the saw blade, but I always err on the side of caution. I went ahead and replaced my table saw blade with just an older blade. I'm not going to use my new the sharpest blade I've got, which is typically what I keep in the table saw. So I pull out the oldest blade that I got and use that to do all my metal cutting with. I know I said earlier that we were going to cut the blade and the wearing strip to the final lengths over at the miter saw, but I decided, since I had the old blade in the table saw here, to just go ahead and whip out the crosscut sled and then just make all my finished length cuts on both the blade and the wearing strips here at the table saw. That way I don't have to swap out the blade over at the miter saw, and I only have to do it here at the table saw. And don't make fun of my crosscut sled. That is a future project, and you'll probably see that in an upcoming video here on the channel. Now that we have our blades and our wearing strips cut down to the final widths and lengths, now what I've done is I've taken some self-adhesive sandpaper. This is 220 grit. I stuck it to my tabletop. That's the flattest surface I have in the workshop. And then I'm going to take and sand very lightly, taking my time just to get any tarnish or anything off the brass and just give it a nice smooth surface. So what I'm going to do is just take my time sanding, I guess what you would call with the grain. I know this is not wood, it's brass, but we're going to sand it with the grain. I've got my fence set up, so I'll have a reference point to sand up against. And again, we're just going to take our time, starting out at 220 grit and then work our way up to 400 grit. I'm not going to bore you with too much sanding. You just want to take your time here. and not push down too hard, and just basically knock the varnish off of it. And you can see it comes out pretty clean. Now that we're done sanding, we're going to cut some traditional profiles on the end of the blades on both the 1¼ blade and the 3/4 inch blade. And this is the type of profile that we're going to cut. So the next thing we're going to do is etch this out and then start cutting over at the bandsaw and then sand it to its final profile. With the brass sanded, for the small blade, I'm going to use a 3/4 inch circle template that I have here, just made out of acrylic. And I'm just going to put a decorative edge on the end of the square. I'm going to do 2 back-to-back arches just to give it some aesthetic value, I guess. But it is going to clean up the end. That way you just don't have a square end. And you can kind of see the etched profile that I put on it here. I'm sorry it didn't zoom in any better, but you'll see when we go to cut this out over at the bandsaw, and then we'll end up sanding it at the oscillating sander. Here's a better picture of kind of an S shape that we're going to have here on the end of the profile. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the larger blade. I think on the larger blade I used an 1¼ inch diameter circle template, and on the smaller blade, as you see here, I used a 3/4 inch. So with the 1¼ inch template, I'm going to do the same thing I did with the small blade for the larger blade. I'm just going to make 2 back-to-back half circles, 1 concave, 1 convex, I guess, and it's just going to make an S shape on the end of the blade here. And as you can see, the best way to mark on metal is to try to somehow scribe, or not scribe, but etch your marking with something sharp like an awl. That way you can see the marking on the metal. It's a little harder to try to mark it with a pencil, or if you mark it with try to mark it with a permanent marker, you might get too thick of a line. So I just used a point of an awl here and just tried to etch it the best I could. And you can see the circle profile here on the larger one as well. So over at the bandsaw, I'm going to cut the majority of the material out. I'm going to leave probably about 1/8 inch proud, just so I can go back and I've got room to sand it once we're done cutting out the majority of the waste over at the oscillating sander. I had an old 1/4 inch blade in my bandsaw. I don't know if it's really recommended to cut metal with a bandsaw blade like it is with a table saw or miter saw. You could cut this out with a hacksaw. Again, it doesn't have to be precise. You could actually just cut it at just a slight angle and then take it over to the oscillating sander to clean up the profile. At the oscillating sander, you just want to take your time and just slowly sand up to your line. I started out here with just the belt sander, but then I ended up swapping it out for the spindle sander. I think the spindle sander worked best for both the small and the large blade. I think I used the 3/4 inch spindle sander for the smaller blade, and then the 1 inch spindle sander for the larger blade. I didn't have an 1¼ inch. That would have been the perfect size spindle, but my spindle set jumps from 1 inch to 1.5 inch, but so you always err on the smaller size. So using the 1 inch spindle worked fine. I was able to sand out the profile on the larger blade with that, and they came out real nice. So now we're going to take a break from working on the blades and the wearing strips, and we're going to focus our attention on the head of the squares. The head of the squares are going to be made, as I mentioned earlier, out of bloodwood. I rough cut these blanks and planed them down, but now it's time to cut them to their final lengths, widths, and thicknesses. So the thickness is 9/16 of an inch thick. Both blanks are at that thickness. And now for the smaller square, we're going to cut it 15/16 wide by 2.5 inches long. On the larger square, we're going to cut it down to 1.5 inches wide by 4 1/8 inches long, and we're going to do that here at the table saw. So these are going to be small pieces, so make sure that you're definitely using a push block to make all these cuts, especially with the smaller square head. The large one's not as bad. but I would still recommend using a push block for both cuts. And that's for the cutting the widths. Then cutting them down to the finished length, I'm going to take and use my trusty old crosscut sled. Go ahead and laugh at it now, but wait till next week. I'm going to bust out the ultimate crosscut sled and show you guys what a new one looks like. The wear strips are attached to the blocks with small brass screws. It's a little tricky to keep them aligned, so what I did is I oversized the wear strip just slightly, and then to temporarily attach them to the block, we're going to use super glue here. And again, that's just to temporarily attach it to the block. Once the super glue dries, I'm going to go over to the drill press and pre-drill and countersink holes for the small brass screws. Then we can install the brass screws and permanently affix the wearing strips to the blocks. Once we have the wearing strips screwed to the blocks, then I can file and sand the screws and the wearing strips all flush to the surface. With our brass wearing strips now super glued to the square heads, we're now going to go over to the drill press and drill out 6 holes on each head for some number 2 by 3/8 brass screws, which will permanently affix the brass wearing strips to the heads. I went ahead and marked out the locations, and I'll zoom in here next and show you the locations of these 6 screws. And you just kind of have to take your time. We're going to have to pre-drill and countersink. These are brass screws, so we want to be very delicate with this process. And we also want to make sure that we leave the screw head just slightly proud, maybe a 32nd, even a 64th, and then we can just sand it flush once we've got the screws fastened to the wearing strips. So let me zoom in and show you in closer detail where I went ahead and just used a punch to punch the hole locations, and I'll give you the dimensions so you'll have those as well. Okay, so on the larger square, I went ahead and marked the center line, and then I marked a 1/2 inch from the edge, and then I made 2 punch holes at each location for our screws, and I measured down from the edge 1/8 of an inch on both sides. So those are my 6 hole locations for the number 2 brass screws for the big square. And then for the smaller square, I did the same thing. I marked out my center line, and then I measured over 5/16 of an inch from both ends, and then 1/8 of an inch in from both edges, and then punched out my 6 screw locations. So the next thing we're going to do is go over to the drill press, pre-drill, and then countersink for all these screws. The main thing to pay attention to here is just making sure that you don't countersink it too deep. Like I had mentioned earlier, you do want the head of that screw to sit about a 32nd to a 64th of an inch proud so you can sand it all flush later. I was originally going to pre-drill the holes for the screws over at the drill press, but the size bit was so small I couldn't even get it chucked up into my drill press, so I had to pre-drill here with just a regular cordless drill, and that was fine. You're only going down about 3/8 of an inch anyway, but you do need to pre-drill because we are screwing into hardwood and we are screwing with brass screws. And just be very careful when you're screwing these brass screws in because it's very soft brass. You don't want to break the head of the screw off at this point. I might even recommend taking threads and just putting them in some paste wax. Since you've already pre-drilled the hole, that should make it a lot smoother to get them screwed in with no issues. Then we'll go back and sand the screw heads and the wearing plate all flush with some 400 grit sandpaper. I don't know what it is, but sanding metal just for me gave me more gratification than just sanding wood, maybe because I've sanded so much wood, but you get a lot more gratification, especially sanding brass, because it just looks so much nicer once you get it sanded down. So now with our wearing plate securely fastened to the head of both squares, it's now time to cut the slot that's gonna be cut across the end grain of the head, and that's where our blade's gonna be fastened to. In order to make this cut, I'm gonna make it here at the table saw. I went ahead and made a custom push block specifically for this because it's an end grain cut and these are small pieces. I've just used some double-sided tape to fasten it to the push block, and now I can safely push it through the cut, and I'm not worried about securing the block or my hands. My hands are going to be out of the way. I will note that I did use the same thickness push block as the actual head of the square, which was 9/16 of an inch, and then I used some 1/4 inch just to cover up the block to keep it securely fastened between the push block and the fence. I've raised my blade to 11/16 of an inch. That's the depth of our slot cut here on the small square. On the large square, we're gonna have to raise the blade to 1 1/8. As far as the width or the cut that we're gonna make, our fence, I've got the fence set up right now, so the cut's gonna be directly in the middle of the head. So that's gonna be the same distance for both the small and the larger square. So we're not gonna have to move the fence. After I cut the slot in the small square head, then I'll just raise the blade to 1 1/8 and then make the cut across the larger square's head. And again, these are cuts that are gonna be across the end grain and through the wearing plate. So this cut can be a little stressful, you know, the fact that you're cutting a small piece, but what stressed me out the most is it's got to be exactly dead in the center. So you definitely want to measure 2, 3, 4 times. I even did a test cut on a scrap piece the same width as the square heads, just to make sure I had my fence set up and it was dialed in, so it's going to cut exactly in the center of the head, and they turned out great. With the slots cut into the heads of the square, now we can take and temporarily fasten the blade to the head. And how we're going to do that is just by using some CA glue. Now I have a piece of MDF that has a perfect 90-degree corner on it. I'm going to use that as a template for the squares. So once I apply the CA glue to the blade, I'm going to insert it into the head and then put it up against the MDF template to make sure that it is at 90 degrees. And then we'll let that temporarily set up. And that will temporarily fasten the blade to the head of both the small and the large squares. Then we're going to come back and use rivets to permanently affix the blades to the heads. We'll drill out the holes over at the drill press, and then we'll insert and pin the rivets, and that will permanently secure the blades to the heads of the square. And then the last thing we'll have to do is just apply a finish and polish everything up, and we're done. With the slot cut into the head, next thing we're going to do is temporarily attach the blade to the head. And then I'm going to use, I have a piece of MDF that has a perfect 90-degree corner on it. And then I'm just going to use that as a reference guide to square up the blade with the head. And again, the super glue is just going to temporarily affix the blade to the head. And then once I have it square and that glue sets up, then we'll work on permanently affixing the blade to the head using 5/16 rivets. Take your time with this step because, you know, this is the sole purpose for making these squares, and that's to get them as square as possible. And I'm not using any activator with this super glue. That's going to, you know, leave me a little bit longer setup time. But just take your time and make sure that you get them perfectly square before the super glue sets up. And you can see here with both squares back to back sitting on the table saw, they're perfectly square with each other. So the rivets we're going to be using are 5/16 inch diameter rivets, and there is a male and a female rivet. I'll try to zoom in to see if you can see this. So for the larger square, we don't have to modify the rivet at all. We're going to use the 15/16 diameter end that's on both the male and the female rivet. The only thing we need to do is cut the female rivet shank down to 1/4 inch. That way it will properly seat into the head of the square. So what I'm going to do is over at the oscillating sander, just sand it down from a 1/2 inch, which is I think the length of it right now, and just sand it down to 1/4 of an inch. That's pretty easy to fix. And I've done it here. This is the modified or the 1/4 inch female 5/16 rivet. You don't have to modify the male end, and then that will be used to permanently fasten the blade to the head of the square. On the smaller square, the 5/16 inch diameter rivet heads are too big. I looked for 3/16 of an inch rivet heads. I couldn't find any. So what I'm going to do is, or what I've done, is I modified the rivet head on the 5/16 inch rivet. And how I did that was here at the belt sander. I chucked up the female and male 5/16 rivet heads into the drill, and with the drill turning and the belt sander turning, I just sanded the heads down from 5/16 down to 3/16 of an inch. So you can see the smaller rivet heads compared to the 5/16 rivet head. So this way these will fit in the smaller body of the smaller square. So that's how you do that. You just use the horizontal belt sander with it chucked up in a drill, with the drill running. That way you're getting a constant spin, and you can just spin the 5/16 diameter rivet down to 3/16 of an inch. Now with my rivets modified and are ready, we can start drilling out the heads of the squares to accept the male and female rivets, and then we'll pin the rivets into the square, and that will permanently affix the blades to the square. So for the layout of the rivets on the small square, I just measured over 1/4 inch from the edges and drilled a hole for the first 2 rivets, and then the 3rd rivet is in the center of the head of the square. And then for the large one, I did the same thing, except just measured over 3/8 of an inch from the ends. And then I'm using a 1/16 inch bit here just as a pilot bit, just to align the hole locations. With the pilot holes drilled, we're going to jump over here to the drill press. For the larger square, I've got a 5/16 brad bit chucked up in the drill press, and I'm going to use this brad bit just to countersink the rivet heads. Again, this is a 5/16 inch bit, and I'm probably going to drill down maybe a 1/16 of an inch. And again, here you want to remember to keep the rivet head probably about a 32nd or a 1/64 of an inch proud, because we can go back then and sand it flush with the head of the square. And then for the smaller square, I'm going to use a 3/16 of an inch brad bit. And then once I get the counter sunk holes drilled, then I'm going to change out to an 1/8 inch bit and use the 1/8 inch bit to drill all the way through the rivet, or all the way through the body of the square and the blade. Now it's time to pin the rivets, and I'm just going to use a paint and body dent repair hammer and kind of anvil here just to pin the rivets into the body of the square. And then once they're pinned, I can then take and start the sanding process. And I'm going to start with 220 and then work my way up to 400 grit. And this is the reason why we left the rivets proud. That way when we do go back and sand everything is nice and flush to the body of the square. And it really gives it a nice clean look. And you know, I highly recommend doing this project. At the end of the day, I think it took me probably a little less than a day to build both these squares. So it's definitely a project that you can tackle in a day. And I probably could have built a 3rd square if I wanted to at the same time. And I probably will go back and build a larger square, because I was very happy with how they turned out. Well, that's going to wrap up this video. This video wasn't made to downgrade those high-end expensive red woodworking tools. They're definitely high quality, but I wanted to give you an alternative way that you can make high quality tools by yourself, handmade, at a lot considerably cheaper cost. I hope this video helps you out, and if it did, then please leave it a like. If you're new to the channel and you like DIY and woodworking projects, then I invite you to subscribe to the channel. It's free and painless, and I'd also ask that you ring that bell icon. That way you'll be notified of all our upcoming videos. To all my existing subscribers, I really appreciate the support that you've given this channel. I'm Rick with the Ingrain Workshop. We'll see you next time. Have a wonderful day, and God bless.